It is not just Donald Trump who is parroting Putin's lines. Tucker Carlson, who is, a band leader, if you will, for this faction of Republicans who are defeating these bills, was in Moscow interviewing Vladimir Putin. I asked Secretary Clinton about that journalistic endeavor, and this is what she had to say. Tucker Carlson is in Moscow right now interviewing Vladimir Putin.
Right.
The first American, I'll say, journalist to interview Putin since the war in Ukraine began. What does that tell you about Tucker Carlson and right-wing media and also Vladimir Putin?
Well, it shows me what I think we've all known. He's what's called a useful idiot. I mean, if you actually read translations of what's being said on Russian media, they make fun of him. I mean, he's like a puppy dog. He somehow has, after having been fired from so many outlets in the United States, I would not be surprised if he emerges with a contract with a Russian outlet, because he is a useful idiot. He says things that are not true. He parrots Vladimir Putin's pack of lies about Ukraine. So I don't see why Putin wouldn't give him an interview, because through him, he can, continue to lie about what his, objectives are in Ukraine and what he expects to see happen. It's really quite sad that not just somebody like Tucker Carlson, who has, as I said, been fired so many times because he seems unable to, correlate his reporting with the truth, but also because it's a sign that there are people in this country right now who are like a fifth column for Vladimir Putin. And why? I don't know. I mean, why are certain Republicans throwing their lot in? Why are, other Americans basically believing Putin? Why did Trump believe Putin more than our 11 intelligence agencies?
I don't know. Do you have a working theory?
I do have a working theory. But it's more than just the political partisan advantage. There is a yearning for leaders who can kill and imprison their opponents, destroy the press, lead a life that is one of impunity, unbound by any laws. There's a yearning among certain people in our country for that kind of leadership, and I find that absolutely gobsmacking terrifying.
I find it gobsmacking terrifying too, Allie, and it's sort of like we talk about, disinformation on social media. Well, disinformation from people like Tucker Carlson, the platform he has, and the fact that he's a willing participant to it.
And has been for a while. So he's been a big fan of Viktor Orban in Hungary. Viktor Orban comes and speaks at these events here, and Tucker Carlson goes and does his show from Hungary. He talked before the war came out about how we shouldn't be in bed with Ukraine because he called it a corrupt little country. Ukraine had a corruption problem. There's no problem and no question. And when it emerges from this war, they'll have to fix that because they'll be under the watchful eye of the rest of the world. It's not a reason for getting invaded by Russia. One of the things Tucker said is American journalists will not hold Volodymyr Zelensky to account. It's like, I don't know what you're talking about, man. I mean, we cover that war. There are things that Ukrainians do that are not fantastic, and we discuss it with them at all times. But they are a country that has been invaded by another country.
And it fundamentally believes in sort of like, democracy in a way that Vladimir Putin, who has journalists in jail,
Ukraine has been, for 20 years, struggled to find its democratic footing, and it really has struggled. But they are trying and trying and trying, and that's what the larger point is. In the same way that in America, if someone doesn't exactly like all of Joe Biden's policies, what you have to look at for this election is it's existential. It's a choice between who's upholding democracy and who's not. That's your issue in Russia and Ukraine. Who's upholding democracy and who's not. But Tucker Carlson is going to be there and be the journalist that none of us are.
And I say, journalist in quotes.
Yes.
Tomorrow morning, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments as to whether Donald Trump's role in the January 6th insurrection disqualifies him from running for president. Now, this all began when Colorado's highest court ruled to exclude Trump from that state's primary ballot because he had violated the anti-insurrection provision, Section 3, of the 14th Amendment. I spoke to former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton about how she thinks the court will handle such a novel case. The Supreme Court is taking up the 14th Amendment question tomorrow, right? Did Trump foment an insurrection? Should he be taken off the ballot? Let's table the first part of that. But the idea of effectively defeating Trump by getting him off the ballot, do you think that is a good endeavor or not?
Well, I've tried to educate myself on this because it's clear that this is not a section of the 14th Amendment, Section 3, that a lot of us paid a lot of attention to in the past.
Haven't had to.
They haven't had to, thank goodness. But there's a very strong argument. And remember, this argument did not come from liberals. They didn't come from people, who already are against, Trump at all. They came from conservative originalists, as they like to call themselves, law professors, lawyers, who basically said, if you read Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, it's pretty clear that he should not be permitted to run for president. I think the argument is very strongly on their side. Now, what's the remedy? Is the remedy for the Supreme Court to say, no, he can't be on the ballot? Or is the remedy for the court to say, this very well can apply constitutionally, but it's up to the states to make the determination? Because remember, states in our federalist system actually run elections.
Yeah.
And I think that might be where the court ends up. Maybe they could get to the point of saying, no, Section 3 doesn't apply, or you have to be convicted first. They could come up with some out for Trump. But if they want to be true to their so-called originalist interpretation, then I think they have to find that Section 3 applies to people who foment and participate in insurrections, but the remedy lies in the states, which would be kind of a fair way of kind of parsing this.
Do you worry, though, if it's left up to the states, you basically get Trump taken off the ballot in blue states and staying on the ballot in red states?
That's what our federalist system, very well may lead to. I think it'd be better if he were just roundly defeated. But on the other hand, I also don't think it's wise to ignore the Constitution. So it's a really difficult problem that he has created for the courts and for states. You're in a dilemma. If you ignore the Constitution and basically say, we're not paying attention to it, or if you try to write it away and say it doesn't apply, even though I think most historians as well as legal experts say it does, you're also doing damage. So that's why I say maybe they'll come up with this approach. Look, the states run elections. It's going to be up to the states. I think a lot of states will be very reluctant to take him off the ballot because I think that would be a political firestorm in a lot of states. But on the other hand, some will.
I just wonder, I think about the 2016 election, right?
Yeah.
And we're more deeply divided than even then.
Yeah.
And I think about the 2020 election where, half the Republican Party, three-quarters of the Republican Party, depending on the polling, doesn't believe that Joe Biden won. What happens if you don't even have Donald Trump on the ballot and one part of a country, elects Joe Biden, the other part of the country elects Donald Trump?
Well, but look at why we're in this mess. We're in this mess because we have a man who cares nothing about our Constitution, cares nothing about our country, cares nothing about real national security. All he cares about is himself. That's all he cares about. He cares about his own power, his own prestige, his own standing. And how do you say, wait a minute, this is not permitted within our system? As I said, I would be perfectly satisfied if we beat him both in the popular vote and in the Electoral College, as Joe Biden did so convincingly in 2020. But we also have laws, and that's what courts are for. They have to interpret those laws.
Joining me now are Chuck Rosenberg, MSNBC contributor and former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official, and Christy Greenberg, former SDNY Criminal Division deputy chief. Thank you both for being here, guys. Chuck, let me just start with you in terms of the scenario that Secretary Clinton paints there, the idea that the Supreme Court might return this decision to the states. How realistic do you think is that coming from the high court?
I've heard a lot of smart people say a lot of different things about what might happen. I'd be lying to you if I told you that I knew. But look, Secretary Clinton is right. In the main, elections are the province of the states.
Yeah.
Right? And they set lots of rules: when polls open, when polls close, when mail-in ballots are due, all of those sorts of things. So is it possible that the Supreme Court returns this to the states? I think so. Strikes me that it would be chaotic.
Completely chaotic, wouldn't it be, Christy? I mean, then it would, I mean, would it not just be up to, depending on what the process is for getting a name on the ballot, the secretaries of state or the voters to sue the secretaries of state to get Donald Trump's name removed?
Right. I think the Supreme Court is going to issue a holding that will be broadly applicable to all states. I think that is what they're going to endeavor to do so that they don't have to relitigate however many different state lawsuits that may come their way here.
Because, the possibility for chaos is endless in that scenario. I wonder, Chuck, because, we're talking about this immunity claim that the president continues to make down in Mar-a-Lago. He's making it in the Georgia case. We'll get to that in a second. Do you think that these two cases, that there's kind of, whether spoken or not, an intersection in the minds of the court? Like they might hand Trump a loss on a presidential immunity defense if they hand him a win on the 14th Amendment case, which would be you can stay on the ballot.
Yeah, it's certainly linked in the minds of the public, I think. Whether or not the justices are thinking of it that way, Alex, I don't know. But it's hard because they don't, in many cases, they can pick what they hear, right? Many, many people petition the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court takes a very small number of cases each year. I think here they're kind of stuck. These are the biggest, most important cases, and they involve really difficult constitutional issues. So I'm not sure you can duck it. And I hope they decided on the facts and the law in front of them, not one for you and one for the other guy. I think that would be a mistake.
Christy, I don't understand. Can you just explain to those of us who are new to the law, that's me, about how, if the D.C. Circuit Court can rule so, definitively on the presidential immunity case, the wisdom of basically throwing that spaghetti back at the wall down in Florida, which is effectively what Trump seems to be doing?
Look, Trump has had a lot of success in Florida before Judge Cannon, and I think he's shooting his shot and hoping that maybe she will come up with some different interpretation. Again, the D.C. Circuit opinion is so good. It is so clear and convincing in how it just methodically disposes of each of Trump's arguments. So for her to come out completely differently, I feel would be pretty lawless at this point. And I actually don't think that that's where this would land, but he's going to take his best shot.
Well, and
if I could add one thing, Christy is exactly right. But the D.C. Circuit doesn't bind Judge Cannon.
Right.
Judge Cannon in the Southern District of Florida resides within the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. So Christy's 100% right. It's a very, very strong opinion, well-reasoned, well-written.
In another part of the country.
In another part of the country. And so if the goal, Alex, is delay, and delay has been the goal, why not raise the same issue in another place?
Could the Supreme Court feasibly not take up the Circuit Court of Appeals litigation and just, if Eileen Cannon takes this up and rules on it, like could an alternate sort of pipeline go to the Supreme Court? Does that make any sense? I'm not making any sense. Could they basically take up Eileen Cannon's version of this and not the D.C. Circuit courts?
Yes, actually. So I would expect that the Supreme Court may have some real questions as to whether or not there is anything there for them to answer. This was a unanimous opinion. It was a strong opinion. So they may not take it up. It may go back to Judge Chutkan, and she may set a trial date. Now, let's say Judge Cannon does something very different, and then
she's been known to do that.
She does. She does something very different. It goes to the 11th Circuit. They have a very different view. Now you have a conflict in the circuits. That may then be something that the Supreme Court would take up. Again, though, these arguments that Donald Trump is making about having absolute immunity, they're frivolous.
Yes.
And so I really don't foresee Judge Cannon, straying too far from what the D.C. Circuit has already ruled, or the 11th Circuit for that matter.
Ukraine is in desperate need of support, but Republicans are not willing to help Ukraine because they are terrified of Donald Trump's retribution. I asked former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton about all of that today. We're here because it's a panel on the future that's in a day of events related to the future of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And I have to ask you, watching the sort of spectacle unfold in Washington around the sort of basic idea of Ukraine funding, mm-hmm. What's your reaction to what the Republican Party has done on this issue or not done?
Yeah. It's fascinating, Alex, because I think a very small minority of the Republican Party has hijacked the party when it comes to a number of things like border security and aid for Ukraine. I actually think that a majority of Republicans in both houses, if given the chance, would vote for both border security and Ukraine funding. It doesn't appear they'll get a chance to vote on border funding because it's not clear that it will pass the cloture requirement. But I think they will get a chance to vote on Ukraine funding along with Israeli funding, and I expect that to pass both houses.
So you're optimistic?
I am, about those two things. I think the stripping of the border security, the defeat in the House of the Israel aid only sets up option for the Senate to pass both Ukraine and Israeli aid and then send it to the House.
I got to think, though, if you're Vladimir Zelensky, right, and this is a matter of life and death, and you're watching a circus unfold, do you think it changes? There's so many reasons why, the globe has thought differently of America in recent years. But a moment like that, where it's so clear that they're sort of engaging in the most base partisan theatrics over such an incredibly critical issue for the people of Ukraine. Do you think that forever changes the relationship America has with that part of the world?
No, I think it raises questions, and those are understandable, because watching this profoundly dysfunctional Republican Party in the Congress, unable to make up its own mind about what it believes, what it will vote for, in part because they are in thrall to Trump, which is just so hard to understand, does, of course, raise questions. But I do think there is still a majority in both houses to support aid for Ukraine. And, of course, President Biden is, fully on board. So at the end of the day, I am hoping that there will be a positive vote in the Congress, which will send a clear message, not just to Ukrainians, Europeans, others around the world, but to our own country. Why would we reward such, not just only dysfunctional behavior, but it's all so unserious. I saw a columnist the other day use the word silly. It's profoundly silly to watch this circus in the Congress where Donald Trump is the puppeteer. I was in the Senate for 8 years, and I know some of the people that are still there. I know they don't believe this. And why they continue to give in to him, I don't understand. I think that the border security would have been a very good time to stand up to Trump and say, you've been talking about it. We're delivering for you, Mr. President, and go from there. So we'll see what happens next.
Were you surprised by their capitulation to Trump's whims on the border bill?
I was surprised, because it was a really serious effort. The Republicans have done this before. When I was in the Senate, we overwhelmingly passed an immigration reform, in addition to security, other provisions as well. We passed it overwhelmingly in the Senate. Then President George W. Bush said he would sign it, and the Republican leadership in the House would never bring it up for a vote. So I've said for years they'd rather have a problem on the border than a solution. But I thought this time, given the seriousness of the negotiation, the fact that it was only about security, that, frankly, the Democrats gave up a lot to support the Republican request for greater security, which I favored, actually. And then at the last minute to have Donald Trump tell people who are independently elected in their states and have an obligation to represent their constituents and their conscience that they had to stop trying to solve the problem and go back to letting it fester for his own political purposes was pretty shocking to me.
And to do so explicitly, right?
Yeah.
There's no...
It wasn't even a surprise, was it?
Right? It's just kind of like Trump's telling us we can't do it because it's not good for him in an election year, so we're not going to do it.
And there were a few profiles in Courage for a little while, people standing up and saying, what are you talking about? We want to solve this problem. That's why we were sent to Washington. But then they capitulated. And honestly, it shows a real danger that Trump poses, where it doesn't matter whether you have a bipartisan agreement to solve a problem or not. If he wants it for political purposes, then he tries to and succeeds in blowing it up. that is what authoritarians do, and that's yet another reason why we can't let him anywhere near the White House again.